Wonderful. And now to the main event. We were, when we first started thinking about what we wanted to do for this year, we of course wanted to bring someone from the Black Lives Matter movement. And it also struck us that we were really trying to start a conversation about our theme this year is local, national, global. Our speaker tonight, Janaya Khan, will help us understand the Black Lives Matter movement in a global context. Many of us are probably thinking about it just from a US framework, or I know that has been my principal lens. And so for that reason, we're very excited to welcome Janaya Khan. Janaya Khan is known as Future in the Black Lives Matter movement, is a Black, queer, gender nonconforming activist, a staunch Afrofuturist, social justice educator, and boxer based in Toronto. As the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto, they are committed to Black liberation, transformational justice, and indigenous sovereignty, and operate through a Black transfeminist lens. Janaya told me they don't like really long introductions, so I'm going to stop there and welcome them to the stage. We are very happy to have you. Please join me in welcoming Janaya Khan. Yes.
Can someone get me one of those t-shirts? All right. So, I know what you're all thinking. What is this cute little gender nonconforming raging homosexual doing on your stage? I am tired. 2 nights ago, we ended a 15-day occupation in Toronto in front of the police headquarters because Andrew Loku, a 45-year-old South Sudanese man who immigrated to Canada, was a child soldier, lived through 16 years of civil war, moved to Canada, went to college, supported his 5 children back home, only to be killed by Toronto police within seconds of seeing him. Seconds. We had several actions last year fighting for Mr. Loku, fighting for Brother Loku. We had a vigil in his apartment complex and outside of it. We crashed a police board review meeting. We shut down both sides of a major highway in the city. And they told us, the mayor and the police chief, just wait for the SIU report. That's the Special Investigations Unit. They're the ones who decide whether or not the police should be indicted. So that report came out 2.5 weeks ago, and we had a 15-day occupation as a result of it. Within that 15-day occupation, we, Canada uses a lot of fancy names for really boring politicians. So, we stormed, we had a vigil at Premier Kathleen Wynne's house for not having a response. We demanded an overhaul of the SIU because they're all ex-cops themselves. We took over City Hall. And the mayor had said that he was too busy to read the very short SIU report, so we printed it up on giant paper and took it to City Hall for him. And then we marched onto Queen's Park, which is where Parliament lives, with a few hundred people. Now, about the occupation, it's cold in Toronto right now. On the second night, because don't forget, Canada is not as bad as the United States, right? On the second night out, the police came in droves, put on their sirens and their lights so that everyone was disoriented. And when I say everyone, I mean a lot of elders and children, queer and trans folks, Black people, indigenous people. Everyone got beaten up by the cops that night. They came in after they disoriented us. They beat everybody up who was there. They were wearing hazmat suits, some of them, so that they could use a chemical to put out our fires. They stole our tents. So on the second night out, there was no fire and no tents. We had no cover. So that's 15 days in the middle of winter with snowstorms and all the other likes. Last year, when I was in an 18-day occupation in Minneapolis, where I just was last night, there was helicopter surveillance constantly going around, police brutality, of course, but they had tents and they had fire. The thing with things like anti-Black racism, same things with homophobia and transphobia, they kind of, ableism, they kind of look the same everywhere you go. Even when we think that they don't, even when a myth of a racial haven exists in Canada. So let's circle back for a second, because eventually I'm going to tell you about the implications of this work and what it means to wake up and receive 3 death threats only and have that be a good day. So Black Lives Matter, right? It's a good time. In 2013, when George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin, an 18-year-old Black man, young Black boy, I should say Black boy, because the distinction matters. Alicia Garza wrote a love letter to Black people, and it ended in 3 words, Black Lives Matter. Patrisse Cullors saw those 3 words and said, this has got to do something, this has got to mean something to us, so she put a hashtag on it. And the movement just didn't suddenly happen. Sometimes you have to plant seeds and see where they grow. But you have to continuously plant seeds. Like, I didn't know when I was in high school and Judy Shepard came to my school and talked about Matthew Shepard that I would be in Laramie myself years later. You just have to keep planting the seeds. And so when Mike Brown was killed in 2014 and Officer Darren Wilson was not indicted, Black Lives Matter really, really, really hit the world in a particular way. Chapters started to spring up everywhere. And when the National Guard was there in Ferguson, Palestinians were writing hashtags too, saying from Palestine to Ferguson, and they were talking about how to neutralize tear gas. Because guess what? The same company that manufactured that tear gas was the same brand that was used in Palestine. And from that connection, we realized that the soldiers that were in Palestine, the soldiers that were in Canada, in London, and in the US were all trained together. And when protests were sweeping across this country, in Canada, we had protests too. And over 3,000 people came out to that in the middle of winter. And we use that to talk about Jermaine Carby, who was a 33-year-old Black man who had just been killed by Peel Police, which is just right outside of Toronto. And if you think about it, that's a continuation of a legacy. Because when Rodney King was beaten in LA in the 90s, and there was video footage at a time when video footage couldn't just happen with pulling out your cell phone. And those 4 officers were not acquitted, those 4 white police officers. We also had a protest in Toronto in the 90s. The Black Action Defense Committee put on a protest, but 2 days before that protest was going to happen, a solidarity rally, Raymond Lawrence, a 21-year-old Black man, was shot twice in the chest by Toronto police. These are legacies that are continuing, and so these are traditions of resistance. And when we had our protests around Mike Brown and over 3,000 people came out, in London, in the UK, they had a protest that had over 4,000 people that came out. And when I went out there last year to do some solidarity work with families who had lost loved ones to police violence, because their police don't actually carry weapons, but it doesn't actually stop death from happening in Black communities from police brutality. The answer isn't disarming the police. They could tell me everything that was happening in the Sandra Bland case. These were like 15-year-olds. You know, I was in different universities and SOAS and all this, but these were kids that were under 15. And they told me every single point of the Sandra Bland case in London. And I asked them, I said, do any of you believe that she died the way that they said she did? And not one of them put up their hand. But they couldn't necessarily tell me about Sean Rigg. His sister, Marcia Rigg, had been fighting for him for many, many, many years, and he had died not far off from the school. Because what happens here and how we relate to it in the rest of the world actually really matters. Because for whatever reason, this place is still treated as the moral compass of the world. And so when there's silence in a matter, it means something. And even in a place like Laramie, where some of y'all might, actually, I kind of like being surrounded by the mountains and the flatness in the middle. It's kind of cool. But I often come to these places and folks, I end up in a lot of small towns, smaller cities, university towns, and they always tell me, well, yeah, but none of that's really going to happen here. And Ferguson wasn't Ferguson until Ferguson happened. Ferguson is tiny, and nobody cared about it. Because the thing is, you don't actually know when something is going to catch fire. You don't know when one of those seeds that you planted is actually going to grow. Black Lives Matter is global because Black people are global. So when Sandra Bland was killed, it wasn't just that some kids in London could tell me about it. It was that an entire new hashtag came out called Say Her Name, and it was really about the intersections of gender and race. And that was really important because we were talking about Mike Brown and we were talking about Freddie Gray, but we weren't talking about Rekia Boyd or Ayanna Stanley Jones. And when you had, as the National Guard was pulling out of Baltimore and the curfew was being lifted because of Freddie Gray's murder in the city, in Israel, which is a very loaded topic in general, Ethiopians were also rallying behind Black Lives Matter because of their treatment in Israel. And when 900 African migrants are drowned at sea because borders don't want to let them in because anti-Black racism happens, that's also about Black Lives Mattering. And when there are hundreds of thousands of people being deported from the DR, Haitians, that also matters. And why is that important? How many of us in the room know that Haiti was the first place, one of the first places in the history of the world to call themselves a Black republic and resist colonization by pushing out the French, and because of that, they were ostracized by the entire world. That Haiti is the beginning of debt, of international debt, because the French said, hey, you actually need us now. No one's trading with you. We'll give you all this money. You'll owe us. We'll come back in and we'll run things from there on. But we don't think about Haiti like that. We think about Haiti as being perpetually unstable. We don't think about necessarily the states and how much of what's happening in Haiti is orchestrated by here. Or if some of us are really interested in climate change, for example, we're like environmental justice warriors. Who are the populations of people who are going to be most directly impacted by climate change? Those populations of people are found on the continent of Africa. And if your major concern is around naming things like rape culture, right? Because there's things that we're all passionate about. We tend to be the most passionate about things that directly affect us, me personally, right? And so if you're a champion around slut-shaming and rape culture and you don't recognize that that same victim-blaming rhetoric happens to Black people when we are killed, that we're killed for what we were wearing, for how we were dressed, but more often than not, we are not even allowed to be survivors of violence. If those connections are not being made, we are lost. Because when I first started fighting for under Black Lives Matter and for Black liberation in general, yeah, I started it because I was Black. It made sense. It's melanin magic. But the connection has to be deeper than that now, and it is more than that for me. It can't just be based on my identity, because if it were, all I would be doing is fighting to recolonize. All I would be doing would be reshaping colonialism in a way that was more convenient for myself. And so my identity can no longer be the thing that informs my politic. And I think about this year. This year is 2016. 50 years ago, the Black Panther Party was founded here. 50 years ago. And if any of you are familiar with the 10-point platform that came out of that, you'll see that we're actually fighting for the exact same things. And what do we know from a movement like that? We know that a movement that was called too militant and too radical at the time brought some of the greatest revolutionary minds together in this century. Because of that movement, we know that the risks involved for people who fight for Black liberation are lifelong, assuming you get to get there, assuming you live. Because those who did, Sekou Odinga, who spent 43 years in prison, most of which was in solitary confinement, Assata Shakur, who is still on the FBI's most wanted list, still has to be hiding out in Cuba. Mumia, who is still in jail. The implications of doing this follow us for a lifetime, but also so do the implications of doing nothing. Because much in the same way that, I used to think to myself all the time, like, I used to think I was born in the wrong era, because I look really good with an afro. You know? Dashiki, black leather gloves, like, I could get with that. And I used to be mad about that, right? I used to be like, damn, man. But here's the reality. If there's anybody in this room who has ever wondered for a moment, what would I have done had I been around during the civil rights movement? What would I have done had I been around during the Black Panther Party? You don't actually need to wonder. It's happening right now around you. That is what Black Lives Matter is. It is just a tradition of resistance. And if there are concerns about, well, I don't think it should be just about this. If you look at the Black Panther Party's platform beyond what they tell you, you'll know that they had a huge investment in what was then called gay and lesbian relations. It's so awkward. You know? And before the time of social media, right, because we often say, oh, things are more possible now with social media, it was an international movement. They had connections in Korea, in Cuba, in China, and Russia, and other communist countries, which was the word back then. And before, you would have gun battles with the police and you'd be charged with murder, but now you're charged with conspiracy and terrorism. I know a couple of my people who are charged with that, who are being charged with that right now. And it doesn't take a certain set of thoughts or even people necessarily. Let me explain. Bobby Seale, Huey P. Newton, the founders of the Black Panther Party, they weren't remarkable. Assata Shakur wasn't remarkable. George Jackson and his brother Jonathan Jackson, both killed, they weren't remarkable either. They became remarkable when they chose to fight for freedom. They became remarkable when they chose to fight for justice. They became remarkable when they chose to fight for liberation. We too become remarkable when we fight for those things. It's an idea that turns into a vision and a movement actualizes around it. And that's important because really what I'm talking about isn't Black power movements. When I talk about indigenous sovereignty, it's not necessarily having an armed battalion where we block off a piece of the land. What I'm talking about is actually imagination. Let me explain. Somebody imagined shackles on Black wrists, and enough people believed it to make it true. Somebody imagined borders, and enough people believed it to make it true. Somebody imagined the police, the way that it is, and enough people believed it to make it true. We have to be the disruptors of truth. We have to be the diviners of change. We have to imagine differently and make it true. That's really what Black Lives Matter is about more than anything. When I watch some of those documentaries about King, for example, Martin Luther King, and they never talk about the 10 or 20 Black women who put his ass up there, right? Mississippi bus boycott, right? They don't talk about that. You get these really neat stories, yeah? Like, it's really packaged in a certain way, and sometimes they'll make it so that, like, it happened in Selma as if Selma was just randomly selected. But the stories are neat It's like this thing happens, and then this thing happens, and then they fought for this thing, and they won this thing. But it doesn't actually look that way in real life. It's very ugly. It's very ugly, and it's gritty, and it's unsexy, and it's isolating. And I still couldn't think of doing anything else. Because here's the reality for being Black or Caribbean Black or African in this world: whether you choose to fight or not, you die anyway. That is also the truth for trans women. That is the truth for so many disabled folks. That's the truth for so many indigenous folks. So many sex working folks: whether you fight or not, you die anyway. Not one person that I've named woke up that day, left their home, those who got to, and thought, this is the day that I'm going to die. Not a single one of them. And so why I do this work isn't just for people who look like me, because it could be any one of us. Because it actually is all of us or none of us. That's the only way it's going to work. And if you live in a place like Canada, right, where our land mass is 1.1% larger than the United States, but our whole population could fit into the state of California. We're actually less than. We have about 35 million people. They got about 38 million in California alone. Of that 35 million, only 2.9% are Black. Toronto, where I live, is the Black city in Canada. We make up 8.8%. But we represent 10% in the country, remember, less than 3%, but we represent 10% of the Canadian federal inmate population. Those numbers are astronomical. 60% of those arrests happen in Ontario, the province where I live. And even in a place, that no one's ever heard of, like Ottawa, which is supposed to be our capital, never go there. But when Sandra Bland was killed, a mural went up. It didn't even say Black Lives Matter. It was just Sandra Bland's face in these beautiful Black colors. And within hours, somebody had already spray painted All Lives Matter across her face. In Toronto, there was a practice called carding, which one of BLMTO's successes is we put a pause on that. We fought and won some changes in that, even though we wanted it abolished completely. The carding practices, which is stop and frisk. You are 4 times more likely to be carded in the city of Toronto than any other population if you are a Black person. That means constant police harassment. And if you are an Indigenous woman in Canada, you are 5 times more likely to die a violent death. 5 times. So the thing with a place like Canada is that we're never actually going to have a national Black movement, because we don't have the population to support it. So my team is made up of intersecting identities. The people who stood with us the most, who never left in that occupation, were Indigenous people. Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Iroquois, the Mohawk Warrior Society. They stayed with us. They never left our side. And if you are someone who is in academia, which often in certain contexts frames activism, you would know that that's not supposed to happen because of settler colonialism and narratives of stolen land versus stolen labor. You get me. But that didn't matter on the ground, because what we discovered in that moment, how do I as a Black person, right, as a Caribbean Black person, in a place like Canada where Indigenous genocide is a reality every single day, how do we have a Black occupation? How do you hold that? Even though our incarceration rates are similar, and even though stolen land and stolen labor happen simultaneously, because though some of you might not know it, enslavement existed in Canada for 300 years. It was really simple. Black Lives Matter on Indigenous land. And we built solidarity from that. And I'm seeing in a school like this, for example, I feel like I'm in Canada, to be honest, y'all. But this is the thing. We're not going to have a national Black movement in Canada. So we have a Black Lives Matter solidarity team, and they are beasts. They made it so that our occupation could happen, because it wasn't just an occupation where we sat out in the cold. It was an occupation that had police liaisons on site 24/7. It had transportation coordinators 24/7. It had site coordinators 24/7. We had 3 hot meals dropped off every single day. We had to keep people warm, but how do you do that without fires? How do you do that without tents? So we had to have constant programming. So Fight for 15 came out. They're fighting for equal and fair wages. Labor unions came out to support us. It was everybody. Our allied team is made up almost exclusively of East Asian, South Asian, and white folks. They were there with us every night. And that's really, I mean, what that did was it changed how we understood the culture of organizing, and more than that, how we understood what Black Lives Matter means in a time like today, because what it really demonstrated was when Black people get free, everyone else just gets a little more free with us. Because you start off with the most marginalized and those who have an issue with Black Lives Matter. I wonder, because what is a labor union? Why do unions even exist? Or workers' rights? It was about starting with the most marginalized, right? That was the logic behind it, starting with the most poor and providing infrastructure for them. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. Because when the most marginalized have what they need, we all have what we need. That line was good. Yeah, let's end it there. I kind of want you to talk to me now, because I get really ranty. Super brilliant, but super ranty. And I also really want things to translate for you, and I want hard questions. And when I say hard questions, I don't mean necessarily hard for me, because I've heard them all, but hard for you. You're going to get out of this exchange what you put into it. And so you should be asking me very, very uncomfortable questions for yourself. My dude is ready. Look at him.
I remember I lived in Chicago when Mayor Daley killed all the Black Panthers, or a bunch of them. And I can remember my father, who was a pretty liberal guy, he thought they were killed for 2 reasons. Number one, the way they did not take a Martin Luther King-esque approach to getting what they wanted. And number two, they were for blacks only. And I guess I wanted to ask you, when I see something being held, Black Lives Matter signs being held up and interrupting something, how would you feel if you were giving a talk and a different kind of sign was held up and interrupted what you were trying to do?
So you're referring to people holding up signs that say like Black Lives Matter?
In part, at some of these political rallies.
Yeah. Yeah, here's the thing. That's every day, right? It's not just in physical signs that people hold up, right? It's in every aspect of what's the hegemonic structure, right? It's the culture, it's the educational materials, it's the teachers, it's a manifestation in the police. It's the reality that a sign isn't actually the thing that reminds me about things like white supremacy. It's constantly around me. And so if I were to see a sign of somebody holding it up being like, white lives matter, or something, it's pretty simple. I'm like, I already knew that. Black Lives Matter exists because, and here's the thing with all lives matter, there's not an actual inherent problem with it. It's just that it came in direct attack against Black Lives Matter. And the reality is all lives will matter when Black lives matter, when Indigenous lives matter, when trans lives matter. I mean, that's why we're doing things differently this time. That's why our leadership looks the way it is. And so my answer to you is that happens to me every day. I'm inundated every day. And really, I gotta really challenge people on this because last time I checked, Black Pride was really about drums and protesting a little bit, dancing on the street. White Pride is the one that means death for people. So that's the one I'm more concerned about. Let's just be real. Thank you for asking me that question.
Do you think America's changed its opinion on the Black Lives Matter from the Black Panthers era 50 years ago?
What's your name?
Yusuf.
Yusuf, good question. How old are you, Yusuf?
13.
Oh, yeah, okay. Good question. Do I think America has changed its opinion? I don't. You know, if you're looking at it in terms of the state. But in terms of the populace, I do. You know, and I think, here's the truth, and this is gonna be really scary, y'all. So be prepared. White America is dying. It's the truth. This guy's like, I don't know, man. Yeah. But it is. The historical, socioeconomic, economic, and political conditions are changing. The curriculum is changing. The teachers are changing. The norms are being shifted and changing. And a lot of white Americans are really angry about that. A lot. And those are the folks who vote for Trump. Because and yeah, I think the other thing is like we have to change the questions that we ask, right? I don't start off conversations or expect that, you know, hey, are you a racist? Like, it's not really gonna, you know, that's not really gonna work anymore. And it never really has. And so I think the other thing is we're smarter. And when I say we, I mean people who are in activist work. We expect betrayal from each other. We have to. I'm gonna betray you, you're gonna betray me, because we're coming from such different positions based on power, and that power looks and shifts and changes in different spaces and contexts. The issue, of course, because that's really what we're talking about, is certain people have more power than others, and as Kwame Ture said, you know, if the white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem, but if he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. And so what we're really talking about is power, and this is the scary thing. Here's the really, really scary thing. I don't actually believe, and my comrades and I don't actually believe the issue is the police. We respond to the police because it's the most urgent, because they have power to kill with impunity. But could I trust that anyone else with that power over my life, coming from a place where they've been informed by anti-Black racism and transphobia and homophobia and a myriad of other things, could I trust my life with that person? No. The police aren't the problem. They only have the teeth to see it through. Renisha McBride wasn't killed by a police officer. She was a Black woman whose car crashed at 3 a.m. and knocked on the door for help. And before the door was fully open, she was shot in the head with a shotgun. He wasn't a police officer. And these are the realities. So I think you know, things are changing, and I think that things are gonna get a lot more violent before we get past that. I think revolutions happen like this, yeah? Here's like where you have mass actions and demonstrations, mobilizing all over the world, and we're on the cusp of that. I mean, you're seeing it in South Africa, you're seeing it in Brazil, you're seeing it in Palestine, you're seeing it here, you're seeing it in Canada, you're seeing it in Australia. But all this has to happen first. And so I think we're almost at a peak of the cycle in our generation and in our lifetime, and I think things are gonna get a lot more ugly. You know, the police in Toronto now have assault rifles in direct response to our actions. White America, and white America is not white people. White America is a population of people who ascribe to a particular ideology. Let's be really clear. White America is really angry, and they're going to get more vicious. and more violent in order to try to maintain and keep that particular set of conditions and maintain that power. And so there's changes happening, but it's gonna be a rough road, let me tell y'all. But you know, we ready, we coming.
I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and there is a lot of black on black crime. I think it's mostly black on black crime. So my question is, how is Black Lives Matter addressing that black on black crime?
You know what's bigger than black on black crime? White on white crime. If you were talking statistics, and that's actually what we should be talking about. Black people don't kill black people disproportionately. White people kill white people more than black people ever could. And let's be really clear, no population of people is more concerned with violence in black communities than black people ourselves. Black Lives Matter wouldn't exist otherwise. So the myth that we have to continuously dismantle is this myth of black on black crime. It's what people use to derail movements, and I'm not saying that you're doing that, because I think it's a valid question, because this is what you're told, right? What about when black people get killed? Listen, you gotta look at a population of people or an individual, and then you also have to look at the socioeconomic and historical conditions and the political conditions that inform that person's behavior. This isn't about personal responsibility in that way. We're not capable of just changing our conditions because of things like power. Otherwise, we wouldn't be protesting on the street. You know, and so A, it's a myth. B, it is much like all lives matter, which is, you know, where's all lives matter when white people are killed by the police? I don't see them protesting on the street. I don't see campaign strategies against police brutality and violence. And so really what it is we have to challenge these myths and these narratives that are created, because again, statistically speaking, white on white crime is an epidemic. And black on black crime, which is a myth, and I'm going to stop saying that, violence in black communities is as a result of systemic oppression. And if we're not dealing with it systemically, then we're not dealing with it at all. So the thing that I really would love for y'all to take away from that is that it is a myth. And the other thing is that no one is more concerned with violence in black communities more than black people. That is why we do the work that we do.
There's all kinds of them.
You know, just
Look at this. Here. You go ahead.
So I was just wondering, sorry. So you were talking about how like there's also white on white and black on black. Do you think the media makes it like worse, and do you think that the media helps your cause to kind of show that it helps more, or like how does the media play into that? Like,
can you be a journalist?
sure.
Thank you. Right? Yeah. The media machine is one of our worst enemies. There are 2 slander campaigns happening right now in the city of Toronto against 2 of my teammates, 2 other steering committee members. And the reason why Black Lives Matter Toronto is such an important chapter is that we are the only chapter in Canada, and more than that, we are framing anti-black racism in the country in this time. I also want to add that during the occupation, 3 folks stateside from different chapters, BLMLA, BLMIE, and BYP100, they sent people to us as well. So the movement is really becoming globalized. The media endangers us. I feel like I have to look there's fewer and fewer spaces where journalistic integrity is being upheld, where balanced narratives are happening. You know, I don't know what I'm going to do when Amy Goodman retires from Democracy Now! I'm terrified of that. The media has spun it so that if somebody like me were to get 2 or 3 death threats a day, one of my teammates who has been slandered in the media in anti-black and Islamophobic ways because she is Muslim, she's received hundreds of death threats since. And the media gave us, we have many, many different stations, but one, CP24, they covered all of our actions a couple minutes each time. For the slander campaign, they gave us 10 minutes, an 11-minute segment, actually. But they weren't talking about, Jean-Pierre Bonny, who had been killed in Montreal only 2 days before. And so the media is complicit, it contributes, it is considered authentic in its narrative building and storytelling, and more than that, factual and true. And we need to really start interrogating it. I grew up in in the last generation probably where people really watched television, and everyone took their information from the 6 p.m. news and from the newspapers, and that's how you knew everything. And when we think about what informs culture as we know it, what informs anti-Black racism, the media is directly responsible for that. And the media should also be very directly responsible for dismantling those systems, but that's not how this works. And so I don't trust the media. The media has become and is in so many ways some of our worst enemies. There are some really great journalists, I think, who are committed to justice and committing to portraying balanced stories and balanced narratives. And I think what I'm seeing today, and what I think one of the most important things is we're seeing alternative media sources popping up out of nowhere. People like me and people like those of you in the room can now be online and tell stories and create new narratives that challenge and dismantle the ones that we have. So yeah, in response to your question, please be a journalist. And don't trust what you read in the media and what you see in the media, because much like Malcolm X says, the media will have you believing that the people who are oppressed are the oppressors. And it's very true, right? We live in such a high privileged world for certain people that equality feels like oppression. Whew! Take that in, that was good. Yeah.
Is this working?
Okay. So in your opinion, how much of an impact do educators and teachers and I guess people of higher power impact the youth and people in general by teaching them acceptance and social justice issues?
I think they're integral. In so many ways, teachers are the first people outside of the home, if you are fortunate enough to have one and have access to parents or caregivers. They are the first people outside of that place to tell you what's real in the world and what isn't. And we're conditioned to believe that what they tell you is true, right? We see history books and they're supposed to be the truth, and we get taught history and get taught geography in a really boring, unpoliticized way. And like math, but never like accounting, like balancing checkbooks. But yeah, I think teachers I think teachers are in so many ways, the vanguard. And when they fail to do their duty, I think it's devastating and disastrous. I think that nothing is neutral. Nothing that we do is neutral. And so when teachers and educators treat the information that they're sharing as neutral, I think that it's incredibly dangerous and harmful. And so when you're being presented with a particular narrative of this is what's real and this is what happened in the world. So, if you live in Canada, you're getting told that indigenous people were uncivilized and savages and deserved, better. And so had to be slaughtered and put in residential schools and streamlined through a Christian system before they could understand what civilization was. It was done for their benefit. And Black people had to be enslaved, and they had to be slaves because they weren't enslaved people, they were just slaves. But if you're in Canada, slavery never existed. And, I was here for like a year, and I had to pledge allegiance to the flag and all that other weird stuff. And we're being conditioned. I mean, nothing that you know is neutral, and everything that you know came from somewhere. So if you're walking down the street, and no judgment here, right? But if you're walking down the street and you see a person coming up to you and you want to move to the other side, that came from somewhere. You learned that from somewhere. In the same way that I learned that if there's a group of tall, rambunctious white boys, I better get out the way because I don't know what the fuck is going to happen. That's what I've been conditioned because I've seen things happen too many times, right? In the same way that some of you would skirt around a lone Black man walking on the street, that's what I know too. And so because everything that we know comes from somewhere, we really have to dismantle truths, and the first line of defense for that are teachers. And so when teachers fail, and they do constantly, and with the power that they hold over young people, like we had a zero tolerance policy in my generation in high school, and entire populations of young black people were expelled from my school. And a lot of them weren't able to get back into high school. So a lot of them at this point in time don't have GEDs even. Because that is the reality. And so teachers made that call, administrators made that call, faculty made that call. And so that's an entire generation of people who are devastated, and that's what happens when teachers fail. We have entire generations of people who are devastated, who are ill-equipped to deal with the social ills in the world. And some of the best teachers change the world and transform it by the seeds that they plant and by the ways that they empower. And so, yeah, first line of defense and the vanguard, and I think our educational platforms are really going to be the thing that sort of shifts what we think and what we feel and how we understand how the world works.
So, is this working?
Is this working? Is this working? It's not, is it? Is it?
All right, so my question and struggle is really, how do I and anyone else who is white and who has a lighter skin color than you and many people, and because of that I've been socialized to think that I'm better than you, but I recognize that privilege and I see that that's not right, and I'm still working on being an advocate and standing in solidarity. How do I do that without appropriating black culture and without letting my privilege get in the way of advocacy and solidarity?
Great question. That's a really important question. So I think you named something really important. So let me be really clear, allies and non-black people and white people in the room, the movement can't grow unless you grow with it. The movement can't grow unless you grow with it. We have to actually be mature about things like racism, politically mature. We have to be okay with being uncomfortable. And for those of us who have ever been concerned, right, I can't tell you how many times white folks especially, they're just like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I don't want to do the wrong thing. I'm like, that totally makes sense. Nobody does, right? But here's the thing, you already have. You've already said the wrong thing, you've already done the wrong thing. If you actually want to intervene in that, you have to do something about it. And you're gonna mess it up. You definitely are. And so I think there's a couple of things. One is, don't wait for the actions to happen. Oftentimes it's like, let's just show up to this action, but that's not, don't wait for the action to happen before we commit to justice. I would love if, I don't even know how to articulate this. I would love to know the things that I know now about movement building, and that it didn't have to mean that there was, hundreds of dead black people in order for me to know that. Yeah, so I think, okay, so let's just be real. Appropriation, I think it's a conscious effort of unlearning, you know what I'm saying? So if you like rap music, for example, that's cool. I'm not tripping. And if you want to be Jay-Z for Halloween, that's cool too. But if you paint your face black, that's a problem. You feel me? So it's about the practice more than anything. I think how we understand appropriation, let's be straight up. Every single movement in right now, today, every single group of people who are organizing around justice, they use black strategy. They use our rhetoric, our politic, they use our ideology, they use our aesthetic. And for me, at this point, we're gonna get different answers in different places, but for me, it's actually, you equal it out by actually fighting for black lives, right? And actively sort of unlearning what we think we understand about black folks, and how we show up. So when we have a core team, and everyone on our core team is black, and then we have a core team of allies. And the majority, we have 2 white folks and 2 South Asian folks, and they meet with us all the time. And I love that you're asking that question, and I also want to make sure that we're not being immobilized by that question. Does that make sense? Like, fear of appropriation isn't something that's going to be resolved until you're actually doing the work. It's not resolved by thinking about it before you do the work. And the way that you mitigate harm is to actually have people who can keep you accountable. So build a team. Have a team of folks and of allies and white folks who are as committed to social justice as you are, and challenge them so that you can hold each other accountable. One of the ways that we do that is we have working groups. So if a ally steps out of line, which is going to happen, and stepping out of line could be like saying like, well, I don't know, like Future's just so angry all the time. I'm like, okay, that's anti-black racism. I'm a layered and complex person. I have different emotions. So we're not going to wild out. I'm going to be like, hey, so you should probably check out the working group and tell them what happened. And the working group will say, okay, so what's coming up for you? And they're the ones who will hold your feelings. And they're the ones who you can engage in that sort of thing. But more than that, if you and I have trust, you and I can have that conversation. And so really it's about building trust in yourself and trust in the community that you're building around you, because you're going to mess up, you're going to say the wrong thing, your privilege will be showing at different points in time. And you have to move through it anyway. Like, yeah, I got a lot of oppression, on my body. And I also got a lot of privileges. For one, I'm fine as hell, right? I'm able-bodied, I'm lean, and I'm black, but I'm light-skinned. And so I have said things that are ableist. And I have, at a point in time in my life, not considered what it means to have light skin privilege as a black person. Or, I wouldn't come up on a stage and say, hey, by the way, you all would be receiving me very differently if I were 60 pounds heavier, dark skinned, and in a wheelchair. But you would. And so it's about understanding that everybody has privilege. Everybody. But the implications of what your betrayal might look like on my body are significantly higher. And so it's really about being as accountable and responsible as we can with that. Does that make sense? So it's, again, power, right? I'm going to give you all a complicated story. Peep this. So imagine this is a case study, because some of y'all will like that. So there's okay, so there's a middle-class South Asian woman, and she writes a Facebook status, okay? And the Facebook status says, hey, I was in Philadelphia and I was walking through this neighborhood, I was walking through West Philly, which is notoriously black and poor. And, I was there and with my partner, and we were walking through the neighborhood, just like looking around, and these group of black youth came up to me, and one of them ended up like punching me in the back of the head, and they yelled Black Power. And she put that as her Facebook status. What comes up for you? It's weird, right? You're like, that's okay. And so because she wrote that on Facebook, right, all these folks were like, you should have beat the shit out of those niggers. You should have hit them and yelled brown power and all this stuff. So what are the issues here? Well, for one, she was hit. We should feel upset about that, right? I mean, really, what she wanted to do, why she made that Facebook status, is to say, this thing happened to me and I'm upset about it. But how would that story have changed if she hadn't have said that they were black? She would still have received the compassion and the holding because something traumatic happened to her. Because that's really what the Facebook status was about. But the damage that she did in contributing to a narrative of anti-black racism, of the violence of black people, without also holding the fact that she's a class-privileged person touring West Philly like she was in a zoo. Right? Balanced narratives. And so really, when I say responsibility, and what those implications of power are, is that the stories that you create in the world will still be seen as more real than the stories that I create. Because one of the biggest privileges that are unspoken is who is believed. When I say something, people don't believe me. Like when I worked for not-for-profit, which they don't work out for me that well, but it's because I'm a revolutionary. But I worked for this not-for-profit, and we would go into schools and we would do trainings on LGBTQ inclusion. This was years ago. And two of my counterparts were white, and so they got there before me. And, we're upstairs. And so I walked into the space and I said, hey, I'm here for this workshop. These two people would have come ahead of me. I work for this organization. So the person looks at me and they're like, do you have a business card? And I said, yeah, sure. And she looks at, she's like, well, do you have ID? And I said, I don't know if I need to be giving you my ID when I've given you this information. And she's like, how old are you? And I'm like, you know what? I'm actually not doing this. She's like, yeah. She's like, I don't know. I'm really uncomfortable with this. So I just walk away. I find somebody else to take me to the space. The black security guard in the building, right? Her ironies. So I go there and I don't say anything to my white counterparts, but I say, hey, I was like, how was it getting into the school? Did they hustle you at all? They're like, no, we just signed in and came right upstairs. It's who is believed. And so even though a traumatic thing happened to that person, and really what she wanted to do was say, hey, I'm feeling really bad about this, because she didn't create a balanced narrative. And because she wasn't thinking about the ways in which anti-black racism actually leads to death for black people, that wasn't responsible. And so it's really about what stories we create and what power is put to them and who is believed. In the same way that, people who are read as women or identify as female, who talk about sexual assault, they don't get believed either. And so it's understanding those things and the parameters of that. It's about taking risks, it's about being accountable, but really constantly thinking about power. And I know that might seem overwhelming, but remember that thing I said about being less rooted in your identity and more rooted in your politic? That's a really important thing. Now, I'm not talking about no Rachel Dolezals, We're not talking about transcending race. It's not about that. It's about, remember how I said I started doing this work because I was a black person, and it made sense. But the more I've learned and the more I've committed to it, the more I recognize that black liberation is a pillar of liberation in this time as a whole that needs to be paired with things like indigenous sovereignty, for example, and trans liberation, for example, and the list goes on. And so I am rooted more in my politic because I recognize from not just lived experience, but from seeing so many different contexts globally of what anti-black racism looks like in the world, and the reality that indigenous genocide and anti-black racism, mass incarceration, police brutality, black death, these are things that are consistent everywhere in the world. Everywhere that there are black people in the world. And everywhere where there are indigenous people in the world. And so it's about rooting yourself in your politic and not being so encumbered by how we understand identity, because we live in the age of identity, right? That's why BuzzFeed is so popular. I'll be like, oh man, I like them cats too, Yeah, and so it's a lot of work, but social justice is really just practice. There's no one book that's gonna tell you, and so practice, practice, practice. You're gonna mess it up. Have a community that can hold you. Everyone in here has already betrayed a population of people, me too. And you get through it anyway, and you work through it, and you be committed to something that's greater and larger than yourself, which is justice, which is actually changing the way that things are in this lifetime, because what else is the point? You get me? Yeah.
Check. Does it work?
Seems like okay.
Hello. So I definitely, as a black woman and a Muslim woman, I support Black Lives Matter, definitely. So I kind of wanted to make a comment. A couple of years ago at the University of Wyoming, one of the directors of the African American Diaspora Studies started the Black Lives Matter movement and here on campus, and they actually did receive death threats. And so it was interesting to hear from you how in a city as multicultural as Toronto, you too received death threats and all of that. And so it was interesting to hear how similar we are, like wherever we are when we're fighting for our rights, we're receiving the same backlash. And so my question is, how do we stay strong in this movement? And when people hit us with the whole black on black crime garbage or whatever, the police are there to protect us, not kill us. So how do we just kind of justify to people that we need to be doing this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions in there, all of them dope. One is around self-care and tactics, and the other is, how to actually get people on board, you know. The question on self-care is, I learned how to be an organizer through boxing, and there's 3 major rules in boxing. One is protect yourself at all times. If you have been socialized as a woman, as a racialized woman, as a black woman, as an indigenous woman, you learn how to do a lot of things. You learn how to take care of communities, you learn how to take care of family, you learn how to take care of relationships, you learn how to take care of organizations. You learn how to protect them. But no one actually ever teaches us, especially those who are socialized as black women, to protect ourselves. And so coming into that, with that as a rule, and a narrative of collectivized self-care. I'm not the tender-hearted queer, though they exist, who's gonna be like, I just really need a bath tonight, and like, I just need to watch some cat videos, you know? But that's part of it. But I'm not the one, because my narrative of self-care isn't individualized, it's collectivized. And what that means is, doing the work is part of my self-care. And doing the work could also look like a bath. You feel me? So the first rule of boxing is protect yourself at all times. The second rule of boxing is the only punch that hurts is the one you don't see coming. One time I got hit so good with a left hook, I lost hearing in my right ear for a full round. It was hilarious later. You know? And so really it's about strategy, and it's about being adaptive. It's about recognizing that there's going to be flack, there's going to be backlash, that the work is dangerous, and so being as strategic as possible around that. But the other thing is knowing that there's things that we're not going to foresee. I know the media is the devil, but I didn't actually think that they'd go after my teammates one by one, creating slander campaigns against them, because we've been, in so many ways, put into this public sphere. We didn't know anything about that, really, you know. The work that I do like this, it's not being in, a microcosm like Toronto, where every single media outlet is like bloodthirsty, and looking to really discredit my team in a particular way. So around the things that you don't know, it's about being adaptive. So that internal capacity building is really, really important. And the third rule of boxing is the punches don't hurt unless you just learn how to roll with them better. And what that means is, when I told people about reading about the SIU report regarding Andrew Loku's death, some of the response was, well, I don't know, but what did you think was going to happen? And let me be really clear, we were devastated. It was like, do you ever see that episode of The Simpsons where Bart's heart got ripped out of his chest and thrown into his treehouse wall? It happened, it doesn't matter. But that's what it felt like. And I think, people think that just because you might know or be articulate around things like anti-black racism or transphobia or homophobia, that you can talk about it, that doesn't hurt as much, or that you should expect it. It still hurts. We might learn how to navigate it and strategize around it better, more effectively, but it still kills, and you got to know that going in. That, on my way home on the 63 Ossington, getting called a nigger on the bus hurts just as bad, even though I left a workshop doing trainings with people who were just as invested in social justice as I was. So those are the first 3 things. This is about strategy right now. People in the room, because the question that I want you to ask me after this is, and I would like a white person in the room who is a student, I would like you to ask me right after this, how do I better support my racialized peers in the classroom? That's the question that you should be asking me after this. One of y'all, think about which one it's going to be. About getting people on board, that's a really difficult thing. That's a really, really difficult thing. I think remember I said that revolution happens like this, and all this, I think for one, it's being very clear on where you are right now. And that every action is an action. It's not about protesting necessarily or being out on the streets or having all these numbers. In a place like this especially, it's critical connections versus critical mass. In a place like this, you're not necessarily going to get thousands of people on the street with you. You're not going to get every single person in the school. So it's about forming critical connections. important connections and building a team around you who are as invested in this as you are. And it can be very, very isolating. And the other hard part is, we know, Asada and Bobby and Angela Davis, but we don't necessarily know in the same way Dream Hampton and Rosa Clemente and Barbara Ransby, who held together that tradition of resistance throughout that sort of hangover period where Black communities were decimated, because of our Black power movements. And so the other thing, and this is the part that's really difficult, is that you have to keep building anyway, because all of that had to happen before we could reach to this place. If Black Lives Matter tried to happen 5 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. It was a lot of people, like people in this room, like people like you, who were doing work that people didn't necessarily recognize. It was about having conversations, creating organizational memory in a place like an institution like this, where there's an expiration date on your activism in this place. Organizational memory is really, really, really important, and we see that. We see things like in Black, BSAs and Black liberation collectives, and about creating things. It's about the creation of things and narratives. Like, for example, you could say, do a call out for folks in the room and say, let's have solidarity actions about this. Or in a space like this, educational platforms would be the best place. So let's have an anti-Black racism training. So you have to learn how to facilitate. And these people got to help you do that. And so it's just about changing the narrative and the rhetoric and the dialogue. And you will know, because again, remember, Ferguson wasn't Ferguson until Ferguson happened. But a lot of people whose names we will never know were doing work then and there, so that when that unrest, that moment happened, people were ready. And it's the same thing in Toronto. Like, I was doing work for years before Black Lives Matter happened. And when we had our first protest, we weren't Black Lives Matter Toronto. We were just like, we don't need that name. We could get our own thing. We got our own swag. But we recognized that it would be most strategic, and we hit up Patrice Cullors and said, hey, we're thinking about starting a chapter here, this and that. Like, what are your thoughts? And, and it was strategic. So the other thing is just finding out what your investment is and what your commitment is. And so maybe you develop toolkits for being racialized in the classroom in Laramie, And that's something that teachers should, and faculty and staff and administration should disseminate. And they should, and it should happen every year. And if it's one of those things where if you build it, they will come. They might not come right away. And they might not even come in your time here, but we gotta keep building anyway, because they will do it. They will. Now, who's gonna ask me that question? I like that.
So as a white student, how can I show up in solidarity with and support racialized people/people of color?
Great question.
Thank you.
Great question. These folks are like, yes, right? This is really, really, really important, because some of the first places where we're traumatized are in classrooms. Let me tell you how I didn't know one day I would say white privilege in my class, one of my lectures. I was a student at the time, so I'm in this lecture with all these people, and I said white privilege, and literally the space fell apart. Like, it fell the fuck apart. And I was like, y'all are tripping, and I was put in a really awkward position, right? When you say racism exists, the first thing that somebody says is prove it. And when you're not like strategic and you don't know how to engage in that anti-oppressive rhetoric, the only way to prove it is to make yourself really vulnerable and talk about all the things that you've been through. So you have to prove racism existed by exposing yourself to a group of vicious people who actually just want to slice your throat open and prove you wrong. Because that's what y'all do. And if not you, your cousins or your uncles. And this is really important. So one is really identifying the language, right? I do a lot of education work, and so I was like, I had to really ask myself, why does that happen? Why, when I say white privilege, does the whole damn space fall apart? It's because this is what white folks are hearing. I'm saying you've never been through anything in your life. That's actually what folks are hearing, and in fact, when we talk about privilege in general, that's what most people hear. And that is actually a product of a failed educational system. Because if we had been engaging with these materials from an early age and an early stage, this wouldn't happen. So then how do you spin it? How do you be able to affirm people's lived experience but also still talk about systemic privilege and oppression like this. Hey, listen, I'm not talking about what you've been through, that's yours. I'm talking, privilege is about what you haven't had to go through. Suddenly people are receptive. And so it's about strategy. You got to go in with strategy. In the same way that we have to go in with strategy every day because we have no choice. And sometimes the strategy is to remain silent in something because we know 30 people are going to turn on us or the professor is going to turn on us. Yeah, so that's one, is what questions are we asking? Are we opening conversations or closing them? So it's really about understanding where people are coming from because at the end of the day, I mean, why do we get into this? I'm going to give you all some concrete strategies in a second, but really, you have to, when I don't know what to do, my barometer is be the person I needed 10 to 15 years ago. And so if somebody should have been having that conversation with you, whatever your social location, 10 to 15 years ago, think about it. How would you have been receptive to it, and what would you have needed to be told then in order to hear it? That's a really great barometer. The 5 strategies that I want y'all to walk away with are these. You ready? They're good. Let me get a stretch. Because anybody who's aspiring towards activism, who's in social justice, who wants to challenge narratives as they are, any one of you, these are the 5 things that are going to happen constantly. And so strategize around them. One is, I'll go through them and then we'll talk about it. Derailment, reduction, minimization, tokenization, hurt. Let's do it. Derailment. What about black on black crime? Minimization. I don't think they meant to be racist when they said it. Reduction. There are other people who are being killed in the world. Tokenism. My boyfriend is black. And hurt. I feel really unsafe having this conversation right now. Okay? These are the 5 things that people will use constantly. And if you are a racialized person, if there's been a time when your intersectional identity has been challenged, you know that having to prove things exist and respond to those things is exhausting. It's exhausting. And so you have to decide in that moment when someone's using these tactics, are you going to open the conversation or close it? Right? Opening the conversation looks like unity, struggle, unity. Right? What does that strategy look like? Hey, so I'm actually really glad that we're having this conversation. It's really important that you brought that up. So here's some things that are really troublesome or problematic in that thing that you said, and unity. And now that we've had this conversation, I think moving forward, we need to be mindful of X, Y, and Z. Right? So that's a way of opening a conversation. A way of closing a conversation is using their own tactics against them. So now, when someone says to me, well, and they derail, and they're like, well, it should be about all lives matter, not Black lives matter, I'll derail myself. Are Black lives not worth protecting? And suddenly the onus is on them. It's like when someone says a racist joke, and you're like, I don't get it, can you explain it to me? So it's those types of things, it's those types of strategies that we have to employ because you actually have to be strategic going into this. That's the difficult part of oppression and engaging with oppression is some people are automatically posited here and some people are posited here. And so anything that they say is really about us explaining and proving it. And it doesn't have to be that all the time. But as white folks, I think, again, from the narrative of the movement can't grow unless y'all grow with it, it's really about challenging each other in that and having really hard and awkward conversations. Because let me tell you something. When I was in London and Paris was burning right next door, and a day later, a Muslim woman was pushed into an oncoming train 2 stops away from where I was staying. The person who pushed her, he didn't just happen. He sat around someone's dinner table and said some racist shit and nobody interrupted him. He cut in front of somebody who looked like that woman in a hijab before that happened and nobody said anything. It escalates, and when we don't interrupt it, it becomes deadly. And so we can't actually be silent in matters of oppression, especially when it can result, and often does, in death. We have to intervene, and that's really what Black Lives Matter is. It's an intervention first and foremost. Because it's a belief system that challenges a belief system. And that's the last thing that I'll share around this thing specifically, is to really know what we're fighting against, right? We're not fighting against a particular institution, a group of faculty, a particular government, a set of legislation and policy. We're not. We're fighting against the belief system. Because if we were to wipe all of that out right now, we would just literally recreate what it is that we know. And you know, like I said, we end up spending a lot of time about the police, but you know what's really terrifying about anti-black racism? So I can't remember what university it is. There's a Huffington Post article out on this. It came out last year. I can't remember what the university was, but they did a test. You know, they do tests. And they hooked up a group of randomly selected white folks. So this is where I really need for us to be okay in being uncomfortable. And these randomly selected white folks, they had, you know, whatever those things are attached to their brain to test their neurological responses. And they had the same thing attached to their heart and the same thing attached to the palms of their hand. And so what they were testing for was the subconscious empathetic response system. And so what they did was they hooked up these random group of white folks, random. And they watched a group of other white people, also randomly selected, get pricked in the finger by a needle, like that. And what happens when we see someone else get hurt, and we know that pain, is, you know, there's a neurological response, there's an imperceptible movement, like more palpitations in your heart, there's imperceptible sweat on the palms, because that's what our subconscious empathetic response system does. So when these same white folks who had a completely normal response to watching other white people get pricked in the finger, when they watched a group of black people getting pricked in the finger, they didn't have less of a response. They had no response at all. That is anti-black racism. That's what I'm talking about. When I talk about dehumanization, that's what I'm talking about. Look it up, Huffington Post. They did I can't, just, you know, type in that some variation of what I just said. You know. But like, that's really scary, because suddenly, you know, if it's a legislation or a group of people or a particular politician, it's really easy, right? You got a target. How do you target that? How do you target that? And that's what that's what it comes back down to when in that first little intro around imagination and how we have to actually imagine differently, because we need a belief system to combat a belief system. So white folks, y'all got to get it together, because the only things that you can agree on across the board, not people in the room, but across the board, the only two things that you agree on is racist, is Donald Trump and black people saying Black Lives Matter. Let's be real. Across the board. And so there needs to be a lot of growth and development in those areas, because again, we're not just talking about something that is tangible and here, although those are the conditions that we often have to rally around with urgency. But it's that, because if I'm getting generational information passed down into my body, for those of you who know that to be a reality, right, that we get information transferred to us just like plants do when we're born, so do y'all. And so if what's being passed on to me in the same way that we pass on if I were a plant, if it's trauma, and yours is the same folks who could stand by in their Sunday best while someone was hanging from a tree, you too are getting that information. Whether or not you activate it, it's there. So in so many ways, social justice and justice isn't about learning, it's about unlearning. And we can all do that. And we can all be responsible for that. So I don't actually need more people on the streets with me. That's not true, come out. I need those interventions around the table, in the classrooms, with your parents. I don't care if they're like 98. If they got Alzheimer's, though, I understand, because that's a serious thing. I'm not talking about actually erasing things like ableism to get to the point. What I'm talking about is actually interrupting everywhere all the time, because here's the thing. We don't know what people are going to take as real when we say it. We don't know. In the same way that I didn't know that Judy Shepard, who came to my high school all those years ago, I didn't know that I would be here today and talk about it. It clearly had an impact on me. So I don't need everyone out on the streets, and I don't need everyone holding signs. I also need for us to agree on what a new belief system could be. I don't believe Black Lives Matter is the movement. the movement. No, I think it is a movement. It is a truth in our lifetime. And why shouldn't it be? Why shouldn't Black Lives Matter be an irrefutable truth that there's value in my life, that there's worth in me, that I deserve to live, and more than that, I deserve a particular quality of life? Why shouldn't that be a truth in our lifetime? And so when people argue about it and they say they're too radical, what is your commitment to liberation as a whole if it can be so shaken by us being too radical? And remember, they thought even then that King was too radical in his lifetime. I told you I could get in the rants. But yeah, we have to, that whole revolution thing, no, everyone in this room, we are maybe like on my own, here's that point, right? Here's that point where mass movement is happening. In my own life, maybe I'm here, right? Really close. But maybe in a relationship that I have, it's all the way over here. And every conversation that I have pushes a little further, because remember, activism doesn't build character. That's not what activism does. It reveals character. It is a call to be remarkable. It is a call to be the people that we actually want to be in the world. And every time that we intervene and every time that we have a hard conversation, the ones that no one are ever going to applaud you for, that's what activism is. That's what it is. Every time that you stand in solidarity with a student, your peer, who is being attacked for having a contrary opinion, that is activism. And if enough people had done that, we wouldn't have to be here at a Shepard Symposium. Maybe it would be another name, or maybe it would be his name, because he would still be here contributing and alive. If we do the work that we need to, we don't need to come together around death. We can come together around something much greater. And every time that we do something about it, every time that we say something, every time that we interrupt a stereotype, for example, something as small as that, we are changing the world and we're changing the narrative, because it's true in that moment. Everyone says, we talk about a stereotype, and the first thing they'll say is, well, there's a kernel of truth in it, right? That's why their stereotypes exist. There's a kernel of truth in anything that we could say ever at any time. It's the truths that we choose to empower that become real. Because in this world, I might be oppressed, true. I also walk with a lot of privilege. But it's like Alice Walker says, the only time that we don't have power is when we believe that we don't. And that is true with every single person in this room. And so we have to believe in our power, believe in our capacity, and if we don't, build it. Sometimes it actually is fake it till you make it. But it starts with those interventions that people aren't necessarily ever going to applaud you for. But those interventions are the ones that are going to have you, when you sit alone, maybe before you go to bed, and say, I feel good about that. Because I did something, I did the right thing. And that information, that affirmation, that's the thing that's going to keep you going. Because guess what? In Toronto, when they took our fires away the second night out, and they put them out with some chemicals that we'll never actually know that ended up burning people, when they put out that fire, they lit 100,000 candles. And those were the things that kept us warm throughout those very, very, very cold nights at 3:30 in the morning, after police harassment and a myriad of other things happening. And so you have to find the thing that's going to keep you committed, because here's the thing. You're going to be asked tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what you were doing in this time. You're going to be asked what you were doing when black people were getting free, and in getting free, we're going to get everyone else just a little more free with us. You're going to be asked what you were doing in the same way that we wonder what we would have done had we been around during the Black Panther era and the Civil Rights era. And when you answer, because you will be called upon to answer, have an answer that you are proud of. Have an answer that inspires the next generation of movement builders to come. Have an answer that inspires you. Because that's really what this is a call for. In whatever way makes sense for you in your life. If I could leave you with 6 words It would be, what are you willing to risk? Somebody count that. Don't correct me, though. That would be embarrassing. I'm good, right?
That was good.
But what are you willing to risk? Every time that you ask a question, that you intervene, that you say something, we're risking something, but we're gaining something far greater. We're gaining something far greater. When we interrupt and when we intervene, we've won. And if we keep winning, we change the world. And it's about those little wins, and it's about those little victories. It's about the victory not being a change in legislation, not being a change in government. The victory is in us. The victory is us. Yeah.
Well, no. Could you give us another round of applause for Janaya Khan? Thank you so much. I hate to call this to an end. Please join us tomorrow, you all. And I know there were still questions. You can come up and chat, those of you who want to. And hope to see you all tomorrow and Saturday.